So I left academia about 10 years ago, but I'm still a recovering scientist, so you'll have to forgive me for using slides. But it's nice to meet many new faces here today, and thank you for coming. And thank you for inviting me to speak as well. So I am now an investor at Foresite Capital Management, and for those of you who don't know, Foresite is a kind of unique fund in that we invest in life sciences and healthcare companies broadly, but really across all stages of the life cycle. So we have a thriving early stage investment practice as well as one that focuses even on public companies and public equities. The thesis is that value creation in the life sciences occurs over timescales that are generally very long. And so we want to be able to follow these companies and partner with them for a long period of time. It was founded by Jim Tannenbaum. There's about over 2 billion assets under management. And I think unique is that we have a team of very qualified scientists and physicians in San Francisco, New York, and now in Boston. And our New York partners, who many of you know, are Matt Butin and Brett Zbar. They've been my mentors as I've entered this field, and I'm happy to make introductions for those of you who don't know them. So this is a very broad investment portfolio, and I'm just going to talk about a component of it which is of particular interest to me, and that's this idea of data science in the life sciences and healthcare. And I've been involved in 3 generations of these efforts now, but it shouldn't escape you that there are many hundreds of companies today that are funded over the last 5 years that are trying to apply methods that were developed for consumer technologies, consumer applications in the technology industry, tools from data science to problems in healthcare across the spectrum from early discovery all the way to clinical care to even estimating risk in an actuarial context. So there's been an explosion of these companies. There's also an explosion of hype. Here's some examples from the technology industry. The one on the left, Time magazine asks, can Google cure death? And believe it or not, the answer is yes. They conclude that the answer is yes. I disagree with that, but that's a longer story. On the right, you see, our colleagues from Facebook at the launch of a philanthropic institute. They're asking, can we cure all diseases in our children's lifetime? And it's a very ambitious mission, but I think hubris is one disease that we definitely won't cure in our children's lifetime. I joke about this, but the truth is from each of these announcements, there are very legitimate programs. I mean, CZI is doing wonderful things to advance the state of the art in single cell biology, for example. Google has a number of efforts, Calico, Verily, and Google Health, and programs spread throughout the organization that are now quite rigorous. And so really, hopefully it's not controversial, what I'd like to try to do is discuss a simple evaluation framework that we're trying to apply that really identifies which programs and which companies in the space are going to be truly transformational. I really think it shouldn't be controversial. There's some examples of companies in our portfolio that I'll go through if we have time, but there's really 4 areas. One is to do with the product vision, the problem thesis. Is it big enough? Is it likely to generate enough data for these methods to be useful? The second is how we think about data science. Ordinarily, we think about machine learning and AI as really generating evidence, but it's actually part of an evidence-generating process that's very old. Third, engineering systems. What are the supporting systems that are required to do this? And then very importantly, many of these companies are differentiated by their ability to productively enlist scientists, clinicians, people who are across multiple disciplines that's needed to get a product to market. So let's start with the first element. A lot of major pharma companies today, there are programs that are targeting increasingly rare subsets of disease where we can have interventions with very, very high effect size. And in fact, that's not what the healthcare system needs. We know that we're spending an enormous amount on healthcare in the US, and that outcomes are in decline, particularly in some subgroups of that enormous population, driven by health disparities and other issues. At the same time, we have such an explosion of information about basic biology, and its connection to clinical medicine in principle is growing. And so the future of healthcare to really resolve this macroeconomic paradox will be tools that connect what we can measure, what we know, to interventions, things that we do to affect health outcomes, and then economic models where we are reimbursed only for things that work. And all of these things where data science is kind of a connective tissue that links it together, they work well, paradoxically, only when applied to big problems in large populations. That's where the data are being generated. That's also the largest unmet medical need. And so those problems are very well matched together. And we look for that rather than companies that are targeting narrow areas, even if the hypothesis in those narrow areas is particularly strong. The second issue that I mentioned is, what is big data? What are we doing here? And I think there is a lot of mystery about this, so I would just point out that big data is nothing new. Actually, the birth of our profession, in a sense, we're epidemiologists working in this space, is a very old experiment that was conducted by the British physician John Snow during a cholera outbreak in 1850 in London. This was at a time, by the way, when we knew nothing about the pathophysiology of disease. We knew nothing about the germ theory. The prevalent hypothesis was that cholera was caused by foul airs. And so what he did is he painstakingly collected measurements of the incidence of cholera, clustered them, plotted them on a map, and found that they clustered around this pump handle on Broad Street, which is still there. You can go and visit a memorial today. And so then, most importantly, he recommended an intervention, which is to remove the pump handle. So without even understanding the disease philosophy or the disease biology, he recommended a successful intervention merely by combining multiple data sets in a unique way. But it's important that the intervention is what proved the hypothesis. It took many decades, by the way, for what was learned from this experiment to spread into clinical practice, and I'll come back to why that's important. So really, the best data science companies, they're systematically accelerating a cycle of evidence generation. I think you saw an example of that in the bioelectronic case that was discussed by the last speaker. But that involves a measurement, some rigorous way to generate a hypothesis, and a way to test it. And so all of the hypotheses that we're generating, not to be abstract about this, I'll get into an example, require experimental validation. Very rarely are you using old data sets alone. New data almost always has to be generated prospectively. And what AI and ML methods do is extend the reach of primary human data. They allow us to use measurements on systems that are far more relevant than the toy contrived model systems that we ordinarily use. What they cannot do is hallucinate statistical power where none exists. And that's why it's so important to think of this as a closed loop framework. So here's an example in drug discovery and drug development where increasingly we rely on primary human evidence through human genetics to find targets that are causally implicated in disease. And there's a set of causal inference methods that are useful there. There's target selection. That results in experiments. And many of those experiments, the outputs of those, are increasingly processed through AI and ML-based pipelines. But the fundamental experiment, the human trial, then results in a refinement of a hypothesis that feeds back into the system. And a less abstract example of this I won't get into is the whole precision medicine hypothesis, in which rather than blunt interventions that are designed to target entire populations, the idea, which we rarely realize for the most complex interventions, is that we target populations and even individuals by observing their states and predicting what will happen. And so you may target a higher degree of care, a higher intensity of intervention, for example, to a population that's at risk. That's a practical example of precision medicine. But it also requires this closed loop system to always refine your predictors with new data. That's how the greatest amount of value is built. So a third area that I mentioned, which I think is actually overemphasized at times, or the emphasis is wrong, is the software engineering practice in these companies. Now, it's not the sophistication of the methods they use that is really differentiating, but it's really a recognition that science is hard and that a lot of what we do is not reproducible for reasons that have to do with error and also lack of statistical calibration. So when we're talking about building companies or investing in companies that systematically accelerate that discovery loop, then it's very important that they have a software engineering practice that really considers reproducibility, scientific rigor, statistical rigor from the beginning, and supports scientists in really scaling up the best scientific practices. So that's what we look for as a differentiator. And then the final thing I mentioned is people. Obviously, to get these things into the market, you can't do that with a team of people who have no experience in healthcare and don't understand what the providers want and what the patients need. Here's an example of that. This is a survey that I did at a company, I won't say which one, that was a hybrid software scientific company. And the question I asked relates to a large 5-year observational study that the company was about to launch. And I asked, how long will it take for the first technical or scientific result or a clinical result that actually represents a clinical benefit? And here are the results. You see scientists and clinicians, they are calibrated to expect that these things will take years, and that clinical benefits, which require prospective validation, they may take even 15 years to materialize. Whereas software engineers, just look at that, it's an order of magnitude disagreement about the amount of time that things take. And that's really measured in months for software engineers, years for scientists and clinicians. So we really look for leadership teams and entrepreneurs who understand how to bridge these worlds and productively employ these individuals who have very different expectations about the length of time over which their work will have a benefit. So we don't have time to go into this now, but I've highlighted some companies from our portfolio that really exemplify each of these areas. And maybe I'll just mention the two at the top in the interest of time, which are two companies, Mindstrong and Grail, that are truly addressing the largest possible unmet medical needs. Mindstrong is broadly interested in mental health, and there's so much health disparity driven by lack of access, lack of stable phenotyping. That's a very large clinical problem, one that if a population is productively engaged to a clinical benefit would also result in a lot of data from which the interventions can be further refined. And Grail, I think you all know that story, is a company that has launched some of the largest clinical studies devoted to early disease biology in cancer, with the goal of effecting a systematic stage shift that would truly change cancer outcomes in a way that pharmaceutical interventions won't. So I'll stop there as I'm out of time, but I'm happy to answer questions about this afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Vic. Thanks so much.